Story 1. My name is Jacob, and I'm a 38-year-old living in a small town in northern Canada. This event took place 2 years ago when I was 36. I live alone in a fairly large cabin in the woods, one of several cabins in our quiet little community where everyone knows each other. Being surrounded by dense forest, I'd often go camping, hiking, and hunting. My younger brother Brett lived a couple hours north of me, and we'd frequently go on hunting trips together. We had planned one last outing before winter set in. Like always, when I'd be away for a while, I let my neighbors know so they could keep an eye on my place. So on Monday evening I told them I was heading out, and Tuesday morning I packed my truck and drove up to see Brett. It was late fall, so of course it was cold, windy and snowy. I only planned to be gone a couple days since we just wanted to get in a short hunting trip. About halfway there it started snowing heavily. Not unusual, but after a few more miles, the snowfall became dense, piling up on the narrow road. My truck wasn't new, but it was reliable, not a heavy-duty snowplow, but it got through normal weather just fine. I was about 20 minutes from Brett's when suddenly the snow beneath my tires slid me right off the road into a snowbank. It wasn't a catastrophic crash, but I knew immediately I wasn't just going to drive out of this one. I tried rocking it back and forth, but the wheels just spun with no traction. I bundled up in my heavy coat and got out to assess the situation. The incline of the road made it even tougher, and the relentless snow wasn't letting up. After circling my truck, I knew there was no way I could get it out on my own. I got back inside and considered my options. No cell service out here, so calling Brett for help was out, but I sent a text hoping it might go through. I really only had two choices: either stay put and hope someone came along, which was unlikely on this rarely used road, or start walking to Brett's town, which would take 2 or 3 hours. The sun was still up, but I worried about getting stuck out in the wilderness overnight as the temperature plunged, so I decided to walk. I grabbed my rifle, strapped my pistol to my hip, and emptied my pack of anything unnecessary. I just had to follow the road, so getting lost wasn't a big concern, but getting stranded in the cold was. The snow wasn't too deep yet, and after 30 minutes of hiking the snowfall lightened up. I tried not to dwell on how unlucky I'd been and just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. But my annoyance soon turned to alarm. Rounding a bend, I spotted a massive tree fallen over the road. Getting closer, I saw the stump was on my side of the road. The cut was clean. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately cut it down with an axe or saw. I scanned the silent woods around me with growing unease. There had to be malicious intent behind this. But how malicious? A stupid prank to block traffic? An attempt to rob travelers? Or worse? And was this recent, or had it been here for days? I decided to keep moving, practically jogging to get distance between me and this possible ambush. But it was too late. "Hey! Hold up there." A man's voice yelled out behind me. I turned to see two men standing by the tree, rifles on their shoulders, waving me down. They were maybe 100 feet back. I froze, debating what to do. One shouted again, asking for help moving the tree. But things weren't adding up. Where were they when I passed by? They must have been hiding. And why would they need help when there were no other vehicles? I turned and picked up my pace, ignoring their calls. They kept shouting for a full minute before their voices faded into the snowy woods. Eventually, I made it safely to Brett's, and we went to the police station to report the suspicious tree and the strange men. An officer came back with us the next day to get my truck. The windows were smashed, everything inside stolen. Having a couple years to reflect, I'm fairly certain of what went down. These guys clearly cut down that tree to trap vehicles on that remote road so they could rob, or maybe worse, to any poor soul unlucky enough to come through. They were probably hiding in the woods listening for engines, ready to spring their ambush. By getting stuck earlier, I unknowingly avoided a much more harrowing fate. I still wonder sometimes what might have happened if I'd stopped to help them move that tree. Every time I picture their silhouettes waving me down, I feel a chill run through my body despite the layers I wear to ward off the cold. I don't take trips up that road anymore if I can help it. Too many bad memories, but at least I can be thankful I made it out of there in one piece when things could have gone so much worse. I guess luck works in mysterious ways sometimes. Story 2. My name is Sarah, and I grew up in a small town located in a fairly rural part of the country. However, during my childhood there were only a few pockets of woodland left due to rapid urbanization. Those wooded areas were bordered by housing complexes. I always hated walking through those trees because they gave me an eerie feeling. But the shortest route from our street to anywhere was a path that went behind the houses and cut through the woods. Whenever I had to take that trail, my heart would race the whole time. But I always had to pass through the woods when my mom sent me to the store or when I walked to school. My older brother Mike used to constantly tease me that the woods were haunted by spirits because he knew how scared I was. In winter, when it was nearly dark as we walked home from school, bigger kids would hide behind the trees to frighten us little ones and demand any money or even our cell phones. Being a small girl, this terrified me. Now that I'm an adult, I was no longer afraid of those woods when I went back to visit my hometown last year. A few days in, it started snowing heavily. My kind-hearted mom called our elderly neighbor Mrs. Jenkins to say she could walk her dog Buttons so she wouldn't risk falling on the slippery sidewalks. This was a regular good deed my mom did for our neighbor. Of course, I told my mom I could do it for her, since I knew she disliked the cold. I wanted to do something nice while I was visiting. So I bundled up in my warmest winter coat, hat and gloves, and took Buttons along the same wooded path I'd always used to take as a kid. Since it rarely snows where I live now in sunny California, I brought my new DSLR camera to capture the scenic snowy landscape. I remember thinking how serene and picturesque it looked with the blanketing of fresh white powder over the familiar trail. Near the start of the path, I paused to take a picture of the quaint little wooden bridge over the frozen creek. As I lined up the perfect shot, a distant scream made me jump. It sounded like kids messing around, so I didn't think much of it and kept going. Although I was enjoying the walk down memory lane, after about 20 minutes, I started to get chilly from the dampness seeping through my boots. Plus, I didn't want to overwork elderly Mrs. Jenkins' arthritic dog Buttons, who was already slowing down. So I decided to turn back. That's when I heard something rushing toward us from behind. We were briefly out of sight, partway into the woods. It sounded like someone hurrying down the main path. Not sure why, but my gut instinct screamed at me to hide. So that's exactly what I did. I paused, then stepped off the trail into the thick bushes and pine trees, whispering for Buttons to stay as I tugged his leash. Just in time, a tall man wearing a black ski mask, dark jacket, and jeans came sprinting by. I crouched down in the snow, clinging to Buttons, who thankfully stayed quiet and still. The man was only feet away but didn't see us, too focused on wherever he was rushing to. I noticed he had something large tucked under his arm. My mind raced. Was it a weapon? A bag of money? Once he was out of sight, I let out a shaky breath. Buttons, and I cautiously re-entered the trail. My hands trembled as I clutched the leash. I decided to forego any more pictures and picked up my pace, anxious to get out of those woods. On our way back, the silence was shattered by a police helicopter overhead. We were still surrounded by trees, so I couldn't see it yet. My heart pounded as the realization dawned. This was no coincidence. Only when we reached the edge of the woods could I finally spot the police chopper circling the area, presumably searching for the fleeing man. I hurried home, mind reeling over what I'd seen. After returning a worn-out Buttons to a grateful Mrs. Jenkins, I rushed inside to find my mom glued to the TV. The local news was reporting that police were searching for a male suspect in a series of armed robberies of pedestrians last night in the area. One victim was hospitalized after resisting the attacker. He was considered armed and dangerous. They flashed a map of the locations targeted. It was the same network of wooded trails I walked daily. Then they showed a composite sketch of the suspect, described as a white male, 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothes and a ski mask. My blood ran cold. It was the man from the woods. I realized with dawning horror that I had witnessed the wanted criminal fleeing the scene of his latest crime. My gut instinct to hide very well could have saved my life. If I had encountered that armed robber on the empty trail, who knows what might have happened. I reluctantly told my mom about my encounter after making her swear not to panic. Of course, she immediately wanted to call the police, but I convinced her I should report it anonymously, not wanting our elderly neighbor to worry that I'd been in danger walking her dog. So I called a tip line and described what I'd seen. The detective said my information helped them narrow down the perimeter to search. He warned me to be vigilant as the violent suspect was still at large. For the next week, I barely slept, tossing and turning as I replayed the chilly encounter in my mind. I jumped at every stray noise, imagining the criminal lurking outside. I begged my mom to keep the TV off so I wouldn't hear any more terrifying details. She wanted to cut our visit short, but I refused to give in to fear. Finally, the good news came that they had captured the wanted man, thanks to an anonymous tip. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, knowing he was off the streets. But even after returning home, the nightmares continued to plague me. In them I saw the trail, felt the cold air burning my lungs as I ran in slow motion from a faceless pursuer. But now when I walk through quiet wooded areas, I am hyper-vigilant, constantly glancing behind me. I realized evil exists anywhere, even in the peaceful hometown I thought I knew so well. Monsters walk among us disguised as normal people, and they are more frightening than any imaginary ghosts I feared as a child. Story 3. My name is Jacob, and my parents never let me go camping as a kid. Even when I turned 18, they begged me not to go, but never explained why. It wasn't until I was older that they finally told me the story behind their fear. Apparently, when my parents, Mark and Jenny, were still dating, they decided to go camping in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Jenny's uncle owned some cabins up there, but my dad said staying in cabins didn't count as real camping. So they brought a tent and other gear, but Jenny still wanted to stay close to the cabins, just in case. After walking around the cabin area, they headed down a trail leading to a small lake. From there, they went off trail, far enough so they wouldn't be bothered, but close enough not to get lost. They set up their tent, went swimming, and overall had a great first day. On the way back to their campsite, however, they noticed a huge black mass moving in the trees ahead. It froze, watching quietly as a bear ambled around, minding its own business. It turned and stared at them for a while before going back to foraging. My dad said it was chilling to see one so close in real life. This thing was massive, at least 400 pounds. As my parents cautiously walked past, they kept glancing back to make sure it wasn't following them. The bear kept looking their way too, meeting their eyes briefly, which I guess was a little odd. When night fell, my dad built a fire and cooked dinner. This is when things started getting strange, according to him. Later, as they talked in their tent, they heard large footsteps and rustling outside. They fell silent, realizing it didn't sound human. The heavy footsteps steadily approached until they heard their metal cooking pot fall and roll on the ground with a loud clang. More rummaging sounds followed as the animal nosed through their leftovers before knocking the pot away. Low grumbles filled the air as the lumbering footsteps drew closer. Sniffing sounds went from the bottom of their tent up to the middle, where they stopped. The beast audibly huffed, its hot breath pressing in on the tent fabric. They could see the imprint of its nose as it sniffed around the tent seams. Suddenly, the animal started shoving its huge paws against the thin nylon, as if testing the tent's strength. My parents stayed frozen, terrified and unsure what to do. The animal moved around to the front near the zipper, sniffing at the tiny ground opening. A few silent moments passed before it aggressively battered the top of the tent, caving the fragile nylon inward. Thankfully, it seemed to just be an exploratory strike, as the tent popped back out when the bear leaped away. For a few more tense minutes, they could hear it circling outside before it hurried off into the night. My parents forced themselves to stay awake until dawn, then quickly packed up and left. My dad said they were lucky the bear didn't full-on attack and shred their flimsy tent, which it easily could have done. But black bears don't typically go after people, so they weren't sure what it was trying to do. Either way, It was the most terrifying night of their lives. After hearing their traumatic story, camping instantly lost all appeal for me. But when I turned 18, some friends wanted to go on a trip. My parents begged me not to go, telling me to learn from their frightening experience. But I arrogantly insisted I'd be fine. We went to a state park known for its great camping. The first day and night were awesome. My friends drank and joked around the fire while I abstained, wanting to stay alert since I was anxious being out there. I finally crawled in my tent exhausted around 2 a.m., while my drunk friends stayed up late being loud. A few hours later, I startled awake to a weird scratching sound. Half asleep, I lay there confused until I heard it again, right outside my tent. Adrenaline shot through me as I realized it was the exact same sound from my dad's story. A large animal sniffing and pawing at my tent. I was frozen in fear, just like my parents, praying it would leave. The pawing got more insistent as the animal walked around my tent, huffing and grunting. Then I heard the zipper being tugged on by teeth or claws. My heart felt like it would beat out of my chest. Desperate, I yelled and screamed, hoping to scare it off. The shadow outside my tent bolted away instantly. I lay there shaking, listening to it rustle around the campsite before disappearing into the woods. Only then did I remember the can of bear spray in my pack. The next morning I told my friends what happened, but they just laughed and said I was dreaming. I know it was real. I broke camp right away and drove home, feeling foolish for ignoring my parents' warnings. When I told them about my experience, they weren't surprised at all. My love of the outdoors died after that night. I won't even go hiking now without bear spray handy. I learned the hard way that some fears exist for good reason. All these years, my parents were just trying to protect me from repeating their traumatic encounter. I'm lucky my arrogance didn't get me hurt, or worse. But hopefully my story can warn others to be cautious out there. The wilderness holds many unseen dangers, as I and my parents learned firsthand.